The water was dark that night, silent, still, and unknowing. Beneath the surface of Newport Harbor, something unnatural sank deeper and deeper. A body wrapped tightly in a blanket, bound cruelly with duct tape, its weight dragging it into the black abyss. It wasn't until investigators would later discover what lay beneath that the shocking truth came to light. The victim was not a stranger. She wasn't an enemy. She wasn't even a criminal. She was a mother, and the person responsible for this gruesome death was her own 17-year-old daughter, Rachel Mullinex. What could drive a teenager, described by her classmates as attractive, ordinary, and unremarkable, to commit such an unthinkable act? What kind of hatred, obsession, or desperation could twist the bonds of family into something so deadly? This is the story of how a suburban teenager, blinded by rebellion and obsessive love, orchestrated one of California's most shocking matricides. The date was September 13, 2006, in Huntington Beach, California. A coastal city known for sun, waves, and suburban comfort. Behind the neat lawns and quiet neighborhoods, though, tensions were brewing inside the Mullinex household. 17-year-old Rachel Mullinex appeared, at least from the outside, like any other suburban teen. She had an innocent face, a normal build, and the kind of appearance that wouldn't turn heads for danger. If you passed her on the street, you'd never imagine she was capable of violence. But beneath her surface, Rachel carried a deep resentment. She lived under the watchful eye of her mother, 56-year-old Barbara Mullinex. Barbara was strict, deeply controlling, and intensely disapproving of her daughter's choices, especially when it came to her relationship with her boyfriend, Ian Allen. Barbara saw Ian as reckless, a bad influence, someone who would drag Rachel into ruin, and she wasn't subtle about it. She forbade her daughter from seeing him, laying down rules with an iron hand. But for Rachel, the more her mother tightened her grip, the more suffocated she felt. Ian wasn't just a boyfriend. To Rachel, he was her escape, her future, her freedom. And in her teenage mind, clouded by rebellion and obsession, Barbara wasn't a protective mother anymore. She was the enemy. The stage was set for a tragedy. That night, Rachel and Ian decided that Barbara's control had to end. Not with negotiation, not with patience, but with blood. Inside the family home, Barbara had no idea the betrayal waiting for her. The ambush was brutal, chaotic, and merciless. Together, Rachel and Ian attacked. Barbara was stabbed over 50 times. 50 strikes of pure rage, pure rebellion, pure desperation. The sound of the blade hitting flesh, the gasps, the gurgles, it was a frenzy. Neighbors later recalled hearing nothing. No cries for help. No warning. Imagine Barbara's final moments, her daughter, the girl she raised, the girl she fed, clothed, and cared for, driving a knife into her body. Imagine the disbelief in her eyes, the horror as the betrayal unfolded in her own home. But to Rachel, this wasn't just violence. It was liberation. In her mind, every stab was a strike against the prison her mother had built around her. When Barbara finally lay motionless, her body mangled and broken, Rachel and Ian showed no pause. No grief, no hesitation. Instead, they wrapped her body in a blanket, bound it tightly with duct tape. The act was cold, methodical, almost businesslike. Together, they loaded the bundle into a vehicle and drove it to Newport Harbor. There, under the cover of darkness, they pushed Barbara's lifeless form into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. For Rachel, it must have felt like freedom. But freedom in this case came with a horrifying price. Barbara's disappearance didn't go unnoticed. Friends and neighbors knew something was wrong when the usually strict and consistent woman vanished without explanation. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. Something felt off immediately. Rachel's behavior raised suspicions, her cold demeanor, her lack of concern, and small inconsistencies in her story. The first clue came from the physical evidence. Traces of blood, signs of struggle. And soon enough, forensic analysis connected everything back to Rachel and Ian. When Barbara's body was recovered from Newport Harbor, the horror was undeniable. The blanket, the duct tape, the sheer number of stab wounds. Detectives hardened by years of crime scenes were shaken. This wasn't just a murder. It was rage unleashed. It was betrayal at the deepest possible level. The community, too, was stunned. How could a teenager, a girl who looked so ordinary, who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, carry out such brutality? The answer was simple but devastating: obsession. Rachel's desire to hold on to her boyfriend outweighed everything else, even her mother's life. The trial revealed not only the crime but also the psychology behind it. Rachel sat in the courtroom, not broken, not weeping, not apologetic. Observers described her as detached, even annoyed, as though the trial was an inconvenience. The prosecution painted her as cold-blooded, manipulative, and unrepentant. They emphasized the brutality, the 50 stab wounds, the attempt to dispose of the body, the callous aftermath. The defense, in contrast, tried to frame Rachel as a rebellious teen, overwhelmed by control, driven to a breaking point. They wanted the jury to see her as a misguided child, not a remorseless killer. But Rachel's own demeanor betrayed her. While family members wept, while friends recalled Barbara as a strict but loving mother who only wanted the best for her daughter, Rachel seemed unmoved. Victim impact statements shattered the courtroom. Barbara's loved ones spoke through tears, describing a woman who believed discipline was love, who never imagined her own daughter would end her life. The grief was palpable, the betrayal immeasurable, and through it all, Rachel never shed a tear. In the end, justice was delivered. Rachel Mullinex was convicted. Her teenage years, the years that should have been filled with school dances, college applications, and plans for the future, were replaced by a prison sentence. Her boyfriend, Ian Allen, faced the same fate. Their love story, once painted in rebellion and passion, had curdled into something monstrous. The sentence brought some measure of closure, but not peace. Barbara's family was left with emptiness. A mother, sister, and friend was gone, her life stolen by the very child she devoted herself to raising. The aftermath lingered like a shadow. Investigators spoke of the case long after, haunted by the sheer brutality. The community struggled to reconcile how an ordinary teenager could commit something so extraordinary in its cruelty. Rachel's fate was sealed behind prison walls. Ian's too. The freedom they craved was replaced by steel bars and concrete floors. But for Barbara, there was no justice that could bring her back. The case of Rachel Mullinex forces us to ask terrifying questions. How fragile are the bonds between parent and child? How quickly can love turn into hatred, discipline into resentment, and family into enemies? Rachel believed she was fighting for freedom, but in reality, she destroyed everything. Her mother's life, her own future, and the peace of an entire family. In the end, she gained nothing. Not love, not freedom, not happiness, only a lifetime of silence, and the memory of her mother's final screams. The smell was the first thing neighbors noticed. For years, people living on the quiet streets of Chelmsford, Essex, wondered about the eccentric woman who kept mostly to herself. Her curtains were always drawn, her behavior unpredictable. But no one could have imagined the horrific secret she was hiding behind those closed doors. Inside that modest home, 2 bodies, long, decayed, wrapped, and hidden, rested in silence. They weren't strangers. They weren't intruders. They were Virginia McCullough's own parents. For nearly 4 years, she lived in the same house where she poisoned her father and stabbed her mother to death. For 4 years, she concealed their corpses while systematically draining their pensions and life savings. This is the story of one of England's most shocking family murders, a tale of deception, greed, and cold-blooded betrayal. The year was 2019. In Chelmsford, Essex, a place known more for quiet suburban life than grisly crimes. But within one home lived Virginia McCullough, sometimes referred to as McClure. She was in her 30s, eccentric, reclusive, and often described by neighbors as odd. Physically, nothing about her screamed danger. She wasn't imposing or menacing. Instead, what unnerved those who knew her was her unstable presence, her unpredictable moods, her isolation, and the strange aura of secrecy surrounding her. But Virginia wasn't just unusual. She was manipulative, calculating, deceptive to a terrifying degree. Her parents, John and Lois McCullough, were in their 70s. By all accounts, they were quiet, modest people. They had worked hard, built a simple life, and relied on their pensions as they grew old. They should have been living out their last years in peace and dignity. But for Virginia, her parents weren't loved ones. They weren't protectors. They were obstacles. Obstacles standing between her and the money she felt entitled to. And in her mind, there was only one solution. Virginia's plan was chilling in its calculation. She began with her father. John poison, it was slow, quiet, and deliberate. She watched as the life drained from him, his body succumbing to the toxins. Whether he realized the betrayal, whether he knew his own daughter was feeding him death, we may never know. But Virginia wasn't finished. Her mother, Lois, became the next target. Unlike her father, Lois's death was violent. Virginia stabbed her to death inside their home, leaving her body broken and lifeless. Imagine the fear in Lois's eyes, the disbelief as the daughter she raised lunged at her with a knife. The betrayal was immediate, visceral, and final, but the horror didn't end there. Rather than confess, rather than call authorities, Virginia did something even darker. She concealed the bodies inside the very house they had lived in. For nearly 4 years, John and Lois's remains lay hidden, decomposing, while Virginia went on with her life. And in those years, she drained them dry, stealing their pensions, looting their savings, and living off the money of the very people she murdered. To outsiders, she explained her parents' absence with vague lies. To officials, she covered up the financial trail. She even claimed at one point that she had been protecting her parents, but protection had nothing to do with it. It was greed, cold, methodical greed. The lie might have gone on longer if not for a growing sense of unease. Neighbors rarely saw John and Lois anymore. Their absence, once written off as old age or illness, became increasingly suspicious. And Virginia herself, unstable, erratic, made people wonder what was truly happening inside that house. Eventually, authorities began to investigate. Financial red flags emerged first. Pensions being collected without explanation, withdrawals, transfers, a paper trail of theft. When investigators finally entered the home, what they found was the stuff of nightmares. Hidden inside, the decomposed remains of John and Lois. Bodies wrapped, concealed, and left to rot for years. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. Detectives were horrified not just by the crime itself, but by the level of deception. Virginia had lived alongside her parents' corpses day after day, eating, sleeping, and breathing in the same house where her victims lay in silence. The community's shock was overwhelming. Neighbors who had waved politely, who had suspected nothing, were left reeling at the revelation. They had lived beside a killer, and not just any killer, a daughter who murdered her own parents for money. When Virginia was finally arrested and brought to trial, her behavior was as unnerving as her crimes. She insisted she had been protecting her parents, but prosecutors tore that lie apart, presenting evidence of systematic financial exploitation. For 4 years, she wasn't protecting anyone. She was enriching herself. Her manipulative nature became clear. She was calculating, cold, and unapologetic. Witnesses described her as detached, eccentric, unstable, but never remorseful. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman driven by greed and resentment. They highlighted the brutality of her actions, poisoning her father, stabbing her mother, and desecrating their dignity by concealing their bodies. Family members and community witnesses delivered emotional testimonies. They spoke of John and Lois as hardworking, humble people who deserved care and respect in their twilight years, not betrayal and murder at the hands of their daughter. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every word from Virginia was hollow, manipulative, a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. And when the jury heard the evidence, the financial theft, the concealed bodies, the grotesque deception, the verdict became clear. Virginia McCullough was convicted of the murders of her parents. Her sentence reflected the sheer cruelty of her crimes. Years of freedom, stolen pensions, and manipulative lies ended in the harsh reality of prison walls. For the McCullough family, though, there was no true justice. The wounds cut too deep. Their parents, their siblings, their friends gone. Stolen not by strangers, not by criminals from the outside, but by their own flesh and blood. Neighbors, too, struggled with the aftermath. How could they have lived beside such horror, unaware of the corpses decaying only feet away? The realization haunted many, a reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight. Virginia's fate was sealed in prison. No freedom, no access to money, no control. Only years to reflect on the crime that destroyed her family and shattered an entire community. The murders committed by Virginia McCullough force us to confront a horrifying truth. Sometimes, the greatest dangers don't come from strangers lurking in the shadows. They come from within our own homes. John and Lois McCullough should have lived their final years surrounded by care, dignity, and family love. Instead, their daughter saw them as assets to be liquidated. She gained nothing lasting from her crimes. Not happiness, not freedom, not peace, only a lifetime defined by deception, betrayal, and the memory of the parents she silenced. And for those left behind, one chilling question remains. How well do we ever really know the people we call family? The phone call was almost casual. A trembling voice spoke into the receiver. "I'm going to miss you, Joey." I shot him. I shot Mom and Bob. The words hung in the air, chilling and unreal. On the other end of the line, her friend could hardly process what she was hearing. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't confusion. It was a confession. On August 20th, 2015, in Tampa, Florida, 21-year-old college student Nicole Nachman murdered her own mother, Miriam DeLeon, and her stepfather, Robert Bob DeLeon, a retired Navy captain. She didn't just kill them. She executed them. The crime shocked the community and raised terrifying questions. What drives a quiet, depressed, socially isolated young woman to pick up a gun and slaughter the very people who raised her? This is the story of how years of control, pressure, and buried rage exploded into one of Florida's most haunting double murders. The setting was suburban Tampa, Florida. Behind the walls of the DeLeon home lived three very different people bound by family ties and suffocating expectations. Nicole Nachman, 21 years old, was a college student. By appearance, she was unremarkable, another young woman navigating the difficult years between adolescence and adulthood. But inside, Nicole carried the weight of isolation, depression, and a simmering rage she couldn't express. She had no close friends. She felt socially awkward, disconnected, and overshadowed by the towering expectations of her parents. Her mother, Miriam, was strict and domineering. She micromanaged Nicole's life, setting rigid standards for everything from her appearance to her academic performance. Her love was conditional, smothering, and often harsh. Her stepfather, Bob, was a retired Navy captain. Disciplined, stern, and commanding. His entire life had been built on structure and control. And he carried those values into his household, expecting obedience and perfection from his stepdaughter. For Nicole, their home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison. Every day she lived under their watchful eyes, judged, corrected, and reminded of her failures, and over time, the resentment grew, quietly, invisibly, until it consumed her completely. On the night of August 20th, 2015, something inside Nicole snapped. She retrieved a firearm and confronted her stepfather first. Bob never saw it coming. One shot, execution style, straight to the back of the head. The precision of the act was chilling, cold, deliberate. Bob collapsed instantly, his life extinguished in silence. A man who had survived decades of service in the Navy, killed in his own home by the daughter he had tried to discipline. But the horror wasn't over. Miriam, Nicole's mother, faced her next. She begged for her life, pleading with her daughter not to pull the trigger. Her words were desperate, human, filled with a fear only a mother could feel when staring into the barrel of her own child's gun. But Nicole didn't stop. She fired again, and again. Multiple shots tore into Miriam's body until her voice went silent forever. The brutality was devastating. Her father executed, her mother slaughtered. And when it was over, Nicole stood alone in the house. Two lifeless bodies at her feet, the walls echoing with silence. In her mind, this was liberation. This was freedom from control, from judgment, from suffocation, but it was also the beginning of her end. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Nicole's phone call, confessing the murders to a friend, was the first red flag. Police were contacted and soon investigators descended on the DeLeon home. Inside, they found the gruesome scene. Bob's body with a fatal gunshot wound to the back of the head. Miriam's body riddled with multiple gunshots. Blood-spattered walls. Silent reminders of the violence that had unfolded. Detectives pieced together Nicole's life. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She wasn't a gang member or a drug dealer. She was a lonely college student who had harbored years of suppressed anger. What stunned investigators wasn't just the act itself. It was the cold precision. Nicole hadn't fired wildly. She hadn't acted in panic. She had executed her stepfather and systematically shot her mother. Forensic evidence confirmed it. And when police questioned Nicole, her demeanor only deepened the unease. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't incoherent. She was disturbingly calm, as if she had finally completed something long planned in her mind. The community was horrified. Friends and neighbors who knew the DeLeons struggled to understand how family tension could escalate into cold-blooded murder. But in Nicole's world, this wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable eruption of years of silence and resentment. When Nicole stood trial, the courtroom was gripped by the haunting details. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of premeditation. Nicole had chosen her victims carefully, first eliminating Bob with a calculated shot, then turning her rage on Miriam. They emphasized the brutality, the coldness, the lack of mercy, even as Miriam begged for her life. The phone call to her friend, Joey, became one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence. The recording played in court. "I'm going to miss you, Joey. I shot him. I think I shot Mom and Bob." Her words weren't panicked. They weren't desperate. They were eerily detached. The defense, meanwhile, tried to frame Nicole as a troubled young woman crushed under the weight of strict, overbearing parents. They argued her depression, her isolation, her social struggles, all of it contributed to a psychological breakdown. But Nicole's lack of remorse was undeniable. In the courtroom, she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't plead for forgiveness. Family members of the victims wept openly. They spoke of Bob as a man who had served his country with honor, only to be executed in his own home. They described Miriam as strict, yes, but a mother who wanted her daughter to succeed, even if her love was harsh. Their grief filled the room, their anger spilling out in emotional statements. How could a daughter betray her family so completely? The jury listened. And in the end, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Nicole Nachman was convicted of murdering her mother and stepfather. The sentence was harsh, reflecting the brutality of the act. Nicole, just 21 years old, would spend the rest of her life behind bars. For the families left behind, the sentence brought little relief. 2 lives were gone, Bob and Miriam, taken in an act of senseless violence. And Nicole's life, too, was effectively ended. The tragedy was total. 3 lives destroyed. The aftermath lingered heavily. Investigators spoke of the haunting calmness in Nicole's confession, the way her voice carried no remorse. The community wrestled with the reality that a young woman, driven by resentment and depression, could unleash such devastation. And Nicole herself would live out her years in prison, caged not just by walls and bars, but by the memory of what she had done. The murders committed by Nicole Nachman stand as a chilling reminder of how silence can turn to rage, and how family bonds can warp into something unrecognizable. For years, she lived under the weight of control, correction, and judgment, but instead of breaking free through independence, she chose to break free through murder. In the end, Nicole didn't gain freedom. She didn't gain peace. She gained a lifetime behind prison walls, haunted by the image of her mother's pleas and her stepfather's final, silent moment. And for us, one terrifying question lingers. When love turns into control, and control breeds resentment, how far can the human mind go before it breaks completely?